I've been doing insurance assessments for going on 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen pretty much everything. House fires, flood damage, the occasional act of God that leaves you scratching your head and filling out forms that don't quite fit what actually happened. Most of the time it's straightforward stuff, water in the basement, tree through the roof, that kind of thing. Nothing that keeps you up at night. This case came through in late September. Property damage claim for a place called Millbrook, tucked away in the hills about 3 hours north of the city. The file was thin, just a basic incident report and some photos that looked like they'd been taken with a flip phone from 2003. House fire, total loss, family of 4 displaced. Standard stuff, except for one detail that made my supervisor dump it on my desk instead of sending it to one of the newer guys. The fire had happened exactly 20 years after the last major incident in Millbrook. And 20 years before that. And 20 years before that. Probably just coincidence, my supervisor had said, but he was already looking at other files when he said it. Small town, old wiring, people don't update their electrical. Patterns happen. I'd shrugged and taken the file. Patterns do happen, especially in rural places where folks tend to do things the same way their parents did. But 4 major fires in 80 years, all exactly 20 years apart? That was the kind of pattern that makes insurance companies nervous. The drive up to Millbrook was pretty typical for that part of the state. 2-lane roads that curved through thick woods, the kind of trees that were already starting to turn but hadn't hit peak color yet. October was still a few days away, but you could feel it coming in the way the air had that crisp edge that made you want to roll the windows down. I hit the town limits around 2 in the afternoon. Millbrook was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 600 people if you counted generously. Main Street ran for about 4 blocks, lined with the usual small-town mix of businesses that looked like they'd been there since the 50s. Hardware store, diner, post office, one of those general stores that somehow manages to sell everything from fishing bait to birthday cards. What struck me first was how quiet it was. Not just quiet in the way small towns can be during the day when everyone's at work. This was different. Empty quiet. Like the whole place was holding its breath. I parked in front of the diner and went in to grab some coffee and maybe get a feel for the locals. The place was classic small-town diner, red vinyl booths, checkered floor, the kind of coffee that's been sitting on the burner since morning but somehow still tastes right. There were maybe 5 customers scattered around, all of them older folks who looked up when I walked in and then went back to their conversations in voices too low to follow. The waitress was probably in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of efficient smile you get from someone who's been doing the job for a long time. She poured me coffee without asking and set down a menu that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. "You're the insurance fella," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Word travels fast around here. It does. She refilled the coffee of an old man 2 booths over, then came back to me. "Sarah Hendricks. You'll want to talk to her about the fire. She's the one filed the claim." I planned on it. House was on. I flipped through my notes. Pine Ridge Road. The waitress nodded, but something in her expression shifted. Not unfriendly exactly, but careful. Like she was choosing her words before she spoke them. "That's the old Hendricks place," she said. "Been in Sarah's family for 3 generations. Shame what happened. Yeah, total loss is always tough. Especially when there's kids involved." She was quiet for a moment, wiping down the counter with more attention than it probably needed. Finally, she looked up at me. "You staying in town long?" "Just a couple days. Long enough to do the assessment, take some photos, talk to the family. Standard stuff." Something passed across her face, relief, maybe, or approval. "Good," she said. "That's good. Sarah's been through enough without having to drag this out." I finished my coffee and left a decent tip. Outside, the afternoon light was starting to slant in that way it does when fall's coming on strong. I decided to drive out to Pine Ridge Road and take a look at the property before it got dark. The Hendricks place, or what was left of it, sat about a mile outside town proper, down a gravel road that wound through thick woods. The house had been set back from the road, probably for privacy, but now there wasn't much left to be private about. The fire had been thorough. What remained was mostly foundation and the brick chimney, along with some twisted metal that had probably been appliances. The garage had survived, mostly, though the roof had caved in on one side. The whole scene had that particular smell that lingers around burned buildings, not just charcoal and ash, but something deeper and more complicated. The smell of a life interrupted. I walked the perimeter, taking photos and making notes. The fire department report had listed the cause as electrical, starting in the basement and spreading fast through the old balloon frame construction. It was the kind of fire that moves quick and doesn't leave much time for goodbyes. But something felt off. The burn pattern was too even, too complete. Electrical fires usually have a point of origin that you can trace, with the damage radiating out from there. This looked more like the whole structure had gone up at once, like someone had doused it with accelerant and struck a match. I was crouched down examining what was left of the basement stairs when I heard footsteps on gravel. A woman was walking up the driveway, moving slow and deliberate like someone who had all the time in the world but wasn't in any hurry to use it. "You must be the insurance man," she said when she got close enough to talk without raising her voice. I stood up and brushed the ash off my hands. "That's right. You're Sarah Hendricks." She nodded. Sarah was probably in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered hands that come from working outside. She was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, but her boots were good quality and well maintained. She looked like someone who took care of what she had. "I appreciate you coming out," she said. "I know it's a drive. Part of the job. I'm sorry about your home." She looked past me at the ruins, her expression unreadable. "Been in my family since 1943. My grandfather built it himself, took him 2 summers working weekends. Must be hard losing all that history." "History's got a way of sticking around," she said, still looking at the burned foundation. "Whether you want it to or not." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I focused on the practical stuff. "The fire department report says it started electrical. You have any problems with the wiring recently? Flickering lights, outlets getting warm, anything like that?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "House was old. Old houses have old problems. But we'd had the electrical looked at just 2 years ago. Updated the main panel, replaced some of the knob and tube in the attic." "Who did the work?" "Tom Morrison. He's local, been doing electrical around here for 20 years. Does good work." I made a note of the name. "Mind if I ask where you and your family were when the fire started?" "At my sister's place in town. We'd been having dinner there, stayed late watching a movie with the kids. Got the call from the fire department around 11:30. Lucky timing." Something flickered across her face, too quick to read. "Yeah," she said. "Lucky." We stood there for a few minutes, both of us looking at what used to be her home. The sun was getting lower, and the shadows from the surrounding trees were starting to stretch across the cleared lot. "Mrs. Hendricks," I said finally, "this might sound like an odd question, but I noticed something in the file. There have been some other significant fires in Millbrook over the years. Always 20 years apart. You know anything about that?" The change in her expression was immediate and unmistakable. Not surprise, more like she'd been expecting the question and dreading having to answer it. "That's just coincidence," she said, but her voice had gone flat. "Small town, old buildings. These things happen. 4 major fires, all exactly 20 years apart? That's a pretty specific coincidence." Sarah looked at me directly for the first time since she'd arrived. Her eyes were gray like storm clouds, and they held something that might have been warning. "Mr.?" She paused, waiting. "Coleman. Jack Coleman." "Mr. Coleman, there are things about small towns that outsiders don't always understand. Old places have old rhythms. Old problems that come and go in their own time. Sometimes the best thing you can do is finish your work and let sleeping dogs lie." It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't a friendly suggestion either. I'd heard variations of that speech in a dozen small towns over the years. Usually it meant there was something the locals preferred to keep private, family drama, financial troubles, the kind of small town secrets that seem bigger when you're living inside them. But sometimes it meant something else entirely. "I understand," I said. "I'm just here to do the assessment. Take some photos, file the report, make sure the claim gets processed fair and square." She nodded, but she was still watching me with those gray eyes. "How long you planning to stay in town?" "Just a couple days. I've got a room at the Millbrook Inn." "That's good," she said, and again there was that note of approval, like I'd given the right answer to a test I didn't know I was taking. "Martha runs a good place. Clean rooms, decent breakfast." She turned to go, then stopped and looked back at me. "Mr. Coleman? The fire department report is accurate. House was old, wiring was old, these things happen. That's all there is to it." I watched her walk back down the gravel drive until she disappeared around the bend. Then I spent another 20 minutes taking photos and measurements, trying to shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The Millbrook Inn turned out to be exactly what Sarah had described: clean, quiet, the kind of place that probably hadn't changed much since the 70s but didn't really need to. Martha, the owner, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made you feel like you were visiting a particularly organized aunt. She checked me in without much conversation, handed me a key attached to a wooden fob shaped like a pine tree, and pointed me toward the stairs. Breakfast is 7 to 9, she said. Coffee's on all day in the lobby. You need anything, I'll be around. My room was on the second floor, simple but comfortable. Single bed, small desk, television that probably got 3 channels on a good day. The window looked out over Main Street and I could see most of the town's commercial district from there, which wasn't saying much, since the whole thing was maybe 4 blocks long. I spent the evening going through my notes and organizing the photos I'd taken. The more I looked at the evidence, the more convinced I became that something was off about the fire. The burn pattern, the timing, the way everyone in town seemed to know exactly what to say and how to say it. But off didn't mean criminal, and it didn't mean the insurance claim was fraudulent. Sometimes fires just happened even when the timing seemed suspicious. Sometimes coincidences were just coincidences, even when they stretched probability a little thin. I was getting ready for bed when I heard voices outside my window. 2 men walking down Main Street, their conversation carrying in the still night air. Should have been more careful about the timing, one of them was saying. Timing was fine, the other replied. Right on schedule, just like always. But with the insurance man coming? Insurance man's not a problem. He'll do his job, file his report, and that'll be the end of it, just like the others. Their voices faded as they moved down the street. I stayed at the window for a few more minutes, watching the empty sidewalks and trying to convince myself I'd misheard the conversation. Just like the others. I pulled the curtains closed and tried to focus on something else, but sleep was a long time coming. Outside, Millbrook settled into the kind of deep quiet that only comes to small towns after dark. But even with the windows closed, I could hear things, the distant sound of footsteps on pavement, low voices having conversations I couldn't quite make out, the occasional car engine starting up and driving away. It might have been perfectly normal small-town nightlife. People finishing up late shifts, heading home from friends' houses, the usual rhythm of a community winding down for the day. Or it might have been something else entirely. I lay there listening to the sounds of Millbrook after midnight, and tried not to think about what Sarah Hendricks had said about old places having old rhythms. Old problems that come and go in their own time. Every 20 years like clockwork. The next morning brought rain, not a heavy downpour but the kind of steady drizzle that settles in for the day and makes everything look gray and muted. I had breakfast at the inn's small dining room, which consisted of coffee that was actually pretty good and scrambled eggs that came with toast and local honey. Martha served it herself, moving around the small space with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing the job for decades. There were only 2 other guests, an elderly couple who looked like they might be passing through on their way somewhere else. Sleep okay? Martha asked when she refilled my coffee. Fine, thanks. Quiet town. Usually is. She paused, studying my face. You get a chance to see the Hendricks place yesterday? I did. Terrible thing. Yes, it was. She was wiping down a table that already looked clean. Sarah's a good woman. Been through more than her share. She seemed to be handling it well. Martha stopped wiping and looked at me directly. Sarah's strong. Has to be, living where she lives, being who she is. But there's only so much strength can do when things are bigger than you are. What do you mean? But Martha had already moved on to cleaning another table, and it was clear the conversation was over. I spent the morning driving around Millbrook, getting a feel for the town and looking for anyone who might have information about the historical fires. It didn't take long. The whole place was maybe 2 miles across at its widest point, and most of that was forest. What struck me was how normal everything seemed. People going about their business, kids walking to school, the usual rhythm of small-town life. But there was something underneath it, a current of tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. At the hardware store, I struck up a conversation with the owner, a man named Bill Costner who looked like he'd been selling nuts and bolts since the Eisenhower administration. "You're the insurance fella?" he said when I introduced myself. "Heard you were in town. Word does travel fast around here." "It does. Small place like this, everybody knows everybody else's business." He was sorting through a box of screws with more attention than the task probably required. "Sarah Hendricks is good people. Hope her claim goes through without any trouble. That's the plan. I noticed she's not the first person in town to have a major fire. Seems like Millbrook's had some bad luck over the years." Bill's hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed sorting screws. "Old buildings, old wiring. These things happen. Every 20 years? He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been fear. Not of me exactly, but of the conversation we were having. "Mr. Coleman," he said carefully, "I've been in this town for 43 years. Seen a lot of things come and go. Some patterns that look suspicious from the outside make perfect sense when you're living inside them." "What kind of patterns?" But Bill had already turned his attention back to the screws, and I could tell I wasn't going to get anything more out of him. I had similar conversations at 3 other businesses: the post office, the gas station, and the small grocery store at the end of Main Street. Everyone was polite, everyone knew who I was and why I was there, and everyone had the same basic response to questions about the fires. Old buildings, old problems. These things happen. By lunchtime, I was starting to feel like I was reading from a script that everyone in town had memorized except me. I decided to take a different approach after lunch. Instead of asking directly about the fires, I drove over to the county courthouse in the next town over, a place called Cedar Falls, about 20 minutes south of Millbrook. If there was a pattern to these incidents, there'd be records. Police reports, fire department investigations, maybe even old newspaper articles. The courthouse was one of those solid brick buildings from the 1920s, all straight lines and no-nonsense architecture. The kind of place that was built to last and had the musty smell to prove it. The clerk in the records department was a thin woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Millbrook?" she said when I explained what I was looking for. "That's a ways back. What time frame are you thinking? Last 80 years or so? Looking for fire department reports, police incidents, anything unusual?" She disappeared into the back room and returned 20 minutes later with 3 boxes of files and a rolling cart. "These go back to 1943, she said. "Anything older than that, you'd have to check the state archives." I spent the next 4 hours going through manila folders and carbon copy reports, trying to piece together the history of whatever was happening in Millbrook. What I found was both more and less than I'd expected. The fires were real, and they were exactly 20 years apart, just like I'd suspected. 1943, 1963, 1983, 2003, and now 2023. Each one involved a total loss of property, each one happened in early October, and each one had been ruled accidental by the local fire department. But the fires weren't the only thing happening on that schedule. Every 20 years, starting in 1943, there were other incidents. Missing persons reports, always filed in late September or early October. Usually 1 or 2 people, sometimes a whole family. The cases were always closed within a few months, usually with a notation that the missing persons had been located or resolved, but there were never any details about where they'd been found or what had happened to them. What made it even stranger was the pattern within the pattern. The fires and the disappearances didn't happen to random people. Looking at the names over 80 years, I started to see family connections. The same last names kept appearing: Henderson, Walsh, Morrison, Garrett. Families that had been in Millbrook for generations, all taking their turn in the cycle. I was deep in a 1963 police report about the Walsh family disappearance when something made me look up. The clerk was standing beside my table, and she had that expression people get when they're trying to decide whether to say something they probably shouldn't. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Maybe. These missing persons cases, do you know what happened with them? The files say they were resolved, but there's no follow-up." She glanced around the empty records room, then pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "My grandmother worked here for 30 years, she said quietly. "Started in 1955, retired in 1985. She used to tell stories about the Millbrook cases." "What kind of stories?" She said they weren't really missing persons cases. More like relocations. Families would disappear for a few months, then come back with different names, different backgrounds. New identities, like they'd been in witness protection or something. I leaned forward. "Did she ever say why?" The clerk shook her head. "Grandmother was big on minding her own business. But she always said there were places in these mountains that had their own rules, their own ways of handling problems. And sometimes the only solution was to become somebody else for a while." She stood up, brushing invisible dust off her skirt. "Of course, that was just talk. Old mountain superstition, you know? But the files." She gestured at the boxes. "Files don't lie about dates and patterns." I thanked her and spent another hour going through the records, but my mind was already working on what she'd told me. Relocations, new identities, families disappearing and coming back as different people. It sounded crazy, but it also sounded like a community that had figured out how to manage a problem that came around every 20 years like clockwork. The drive back to Millbrook felt different this time. The woods seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. I found myself checking the rearview mirror more than usual, though there was never anyone behind me on the winding mountain roads. When I got back to town, it was just past 5 o'clock. Most of the businesses were still open, and I decided to make one more attempt at getting information from the locals. But instead of asking about the fires directly, I'd ask about the families involved. At the diner, I ordered coffee and asked the waitress. Her name tag said Donna, about the Henderson family from 1983. "Oh, the Hendersons moved away years ago," she said without hesitation. "Right after the fire. Couldn't bear to stay in town after losing everything." "Where'd they go?" "Down south somewhere. Florida, I think. Or maybe it was Georgia." She refilled my cup with the practiced motion of someone who'd been doing the job for decades. "Lost touch after they left." "What about the Walshes? From back in the 60s. Donna's hand paused over the coffee pot for just a moment. "Before my time. But I heard they relocated too. Somewhere out west. Lot of people seem to leave town after these fires." "Well," Donna said carefully, "sometimes a fresh start is the best thing after a tragedy. New place, new opportunities." I was starting to recognize the pattern in these conversations. Everyone had an answer, but the answers were just vague enough to avoid real details. It was like the whole town had been coached on what to say. After dinner, I walked back to the inn through the gathering dusk. October evenings come early in the mountains, and by 7 o'clock the streetlights were flickering on along Main Street. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and I could see my breath in small puffs as I climbed the front steps of the inn. Martha was behind the front desk, reading what looked like a romance novel with a cover that was mostly shirtless cowboys. "Evening, Mr. Coleman. How was your day?" "Educational. I spent some time at the county courthouse, looking into the town's history." She marked her place in the book and looked up at me. "Find anything interesting?" "Depends how you define interesting. Lot of families seem to have left town over the years. That's the way of small towns. Young people grow up and move to the city, families relocate for work. Natural turnover. Even when the timing's so regular? Every 20 years like clockwork?" Martha closed the book and set it aside. When she spoke, her voice was different, not unfriendly but more serious than it had been. "Mr. Coleman, you seem like a decent man. So I'm going to give you some advice, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." She paused, studying my face. "Some questions don't need answers. Some patterns are better left unexamined. Especially by people who don't plan on staying around to deal with the consequences." "What consequences?" But Martha had already picked up her book and turned her attention back to the shirtless cowboys. The conversation was over. I went up to my room and tried to make sense of everything I'd learned. Fires every 20 years. Missing families who turned up relocated with new identities. A whole town that seemed to be following a script designed to deflect questions and discourage investigation. It felt like a conspiracy, but what kind of conspiracy lasted 80 years and involved an entire community? And what was the point? Insurance fraud seemed too simple, and besides, the fire department reports all looked legitimate. No obvious signs of arson, no suspicious circumstances. But there was something. Something that happened every 20 years, something that required families to disappear and sometimes required buildings to burn. Something that the whole town knew about and had agreed to manage in their own way. I was still turning it over in my mind when I heard the sound. It started around midnight, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not quite thunder, not quite machinery. Something in between that made the windows rattle slightly and set my teeth on edge. I went to the window and pulled back the curtains. Main Street was empty, lit by the yellow glow of the streetlights, but something was different. The shadows seemed deeper, more substantial. And they were moving. Not the way shadows normally move when clouds pass over the moon or trees sway in the wind. These shadows were moving independently, flowing along the sidewalks and pooling in the doorways like thick liquid. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. Trick of the light, imagination running wild after a long day of digging into small-town secrets. But the shadows kept moving, and the sound kept rumbling, and gradually I became aware that there were shapes moving within the shadows. They were tall and thin, maybe 7 feet from head to foot, but they moved wrong. Too fluid, too boneless. Like someone had filled a human-shaped bag with water and taught it to walk upright. And where their faces should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth, blank skin stretched over the general shape of a head. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was impossible. Hallucination, sleep deprivation, maybe some kind of gas leak in the old building affecting my brain. But when I looked again, they were still there. 3 of them now, moving slowly down Main Street in single file. They paused in front of each building, standing motionless for 30 seconds or so, then moving on to the next. Like they were checking. Like they were making sure everything was where it was supposed to be. I grabbed my phone and tried to take a video, but the screen showed only darkness. The camera couldn't see them or wouldn't see them, or they weren't really there to be seen. But I could see them. Standing at my window in a room above Main Street in Millbrook, watching impossible things move through the empty night, I could see them perfectly. They finished their patrol and disappeared back into the shadows at the far end of town. The rumbling sound faded gradually, like a train moving away into the distance. The shadows returned to normal, lying flat and still under the streetlights. I stood at that window for another hour, waiting for them to come back, but the night remained quiet and empty. Eventually I closed the curtains and sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I'd seen. Faceless figures. Moving shadows. Sounds that had no source. Either I was losing my mind or Sarah Hendricks was right about old places having old rhythms. Old problems that come and go in their own time. Every 20 years. The next morning came gray and cold, with frost on the windows and that particular silence that comes before snow. I felt like I'd barely slept, though I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up slumped in the chair by the window, still fully dressed. At breakfast, Martha served me coffee and eggs like it was any other morning. No knowing looks, no questions about whether I'd slept well. Either she hadn't seen anything unusual, or she was used to unusual things happening in Millbrook. "Weather's turning," she said, glancing out the dining room window. "Early this year." "Is it?" "Usually doesn't get this cold until mid-October. But every now and then winter comes early. Usually means it's going to be a long one." I was starting to understand that in Millbrook, casual conversation was rarely just casual. Everything had layers, implications, meanings that went deeper than the surface. "Martha," I said carefully, "last night I thought I heard some kind of machinery running. Late, around midnight. Any idea what that might have been?" She set down the coffee pot and looked at me directly. Her expression was neutral, but I could see something working behind her eyes. "Old buildings make all kinds of sounds," she said finally. "Heating systems, water pipes, settling foundations. Takes some getting used to if you're not from around here." This was outside. Like something moving through the streets. "Ah." She nodded as if that explained everything. "That'd be the road crew. They do maintenance work at night sometimes when there's less traffic. Probably just a street sweeper or snow plow." It was a reasonable explanation except for two problems. First, I'd looked outside and hadn't seen any maintenance vehicles. Second, Millbrook's Main Street was maybe 4 blocks long and probably took 15 minutes to sweep from end to end. The sound I'd heard had lasted for over an hour. But I nodded and finished my breakfast without pressing the issue. I was starting to learn that direct questions didn't work in Millbrook. The answers were always reasonable, always plausible, and always just slightly wrong. After breakfast, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking people about the fires or the missing families, I'd focus on the town's history in general. Sometimes the truth came out sideways in stories that seemed unrelated to the main issue. I found Tom Morrison at his electrical contracting business, which turned out to be a small shop attached to the back of his house on Elm Street. He was maybe 60, with work-roughened hands and the kind of weathered face that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. "You're the insurance man," he said when I introduced myself. "Sarah said you might come by. She mentioned you'd done some electrical work on her place recently. 2 years ago. Updated the main panel, replaced some of the old knob and tube wiring. House was in good shape, electrically speaking. Any idea what might have caused the fire?" Tom set down the wire strippers he'd been holding and looked at me with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this question. "Old houses are funny things," he said. "You can update all the wiring you want, but you can't change the bones of the place. Sometimes the bones have problems that don't show up until it's too late." "What kind of problems?" "Foundation settling, structural stress, moisture issues. All kinds of things can affect electrical systems in ways that don't show up on standard inspections." He was giving me the same careful, rehearsed-sounding answers I'd been getting from everyone else. But there was something in his voice, not quite fear but caution. Like he was walking through a minefield and trying not to step wrong. "Tom," I said, "you've been doing electrical work around here for 20 years. You must have seen some patterns, some recurring issues." His hand stilled for a moment, then resumed sorting through a box of electrical components. "Every place has its patterns," he said without looking up. "Millbrook's no different." "What kind of patterns?" Tom was quiet for a long time. Finally, he set down the box and looked at me directly. "Mr. Coleman, there are things about this town that go back generations. Old agreements, old understandings. Most of the time they don't affect outsiders. But every now and then." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Every 20 years? The change in his expression was immediate and unmistakable. Fear, recognition, and something that might have been resignation all rolled together. "You need to finish your work and leave town," he said quietly. Soon as possible. Before October 7th. Why October 7th? But Tom had already turned away, busying himself with something that didn't need his attention. That's just my advice, he said without looking back at me. Take it or leave it. I left Tom's shop more confused than ever. October 7th was 5 days away. What was supposed to happen on October 7th? And why was everyone in Millbrook so careful about dates and timing? I spent the rest of the morning driving around the outskirts of town, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen the night before. Old industrial sites, radio towers, anything that might account for the sounds and the moving shadows. What I found instead was more disturbing than any explanation would have been. About 2 miles out of town, down a logging road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, I came across a clearing that didn't appear on any of the maps I'd seen. It was maybe 50 yards across, perfectly circular, with bare earth that looked like it had been scraped clean of vegetation. In the center of the clearing was a structure that defied easy description. Not quite a building, not quite a monument. It was made of stacked stones, maybe 8 feet tall, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. The stones themselves were wrong, too dark, too smooth, like they'd been polished by something other than weather. Around the base of the structure were objects. Personal items arranged in careful rows. Photographs, jewelry, children's toys, articles of clothing. Some looked recent, others had the faded, weathered look of things that had been left outside for decades. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the structure or the objects. It was the smell. The whole clearing reeked of something that wasn't quite decay but wasn't quite alive either. Something organic that had gone wrong, turned in a direction that nature never intended. It was the kind of smell that got into your clothes and stayed there, that followed you home and lingered in your dreams. I took photos of everything, though I wasn't sure the camera would capture what I was seeing any better than it had captured the figures from the night before. Then I got back in my car and drove away as fast as the rough logging road would allow. Back in town, I tried to research the clearing and the stone structure, but I couldn't find any reference to them in the county records or historical documents. As far as the official record was concerned, that clearing didn't exist. But I'd seen it, smelled it, and I was starting to understand that Millbrook had 2 versions of reality, the one that showed up in records and reports, and the one that actually existed. The question was, which version was I supposed to be investigating? That afternoon, I decided to take a more direct approach. If everyone in Millbrook was following the same script, then maybe it was time to go off script and see what happened. I drove back out to Sarah Hendricks' burned property, but this time I didn't stop at the house site. Instead, I followed a dirt path that led deeper into the woods behind where her home used to stand. The path looked like it had been used recently, the undergrowth was trampled down, and there were tire tracks in the softer soil. About a quarter mile into the woods, the path opened up into another clearing. This one was smaller than the stone structure site, maybe 20 feet across, but it had the same feel to it. The same wrongness that made your skin crawl and your teeth ache. But this clearing wasn't empty. There were people there. 5 of them, arranged in a loose circle around what looked like a campfire, except the flames were wrong. They burned too blue, too cold, and they didn't seem to give off any heat. The people around the fire weren't talking or moving much. They just sat there, staring into the flames with expressions I couldn't read from my hiding spot behind a cluster of pine trees. I recognized one of them immediately, Sarah Hendricks, still wearing the same flannel shirt and jeans she'd had on when I met her at the house site. The others were strangers, but they had that same weathered, practical look that seemed common in Millbrook. Working people, farmers and shopkeepers and folks who spent their lives with their hands. They were all holding something. Small objects that caught the weird blue light of the fire. From where I was crouched, I could make out what looked like photographs, pieces of jewelry, maybe letters or documents. Personal items, just like the ones I'd seen arranged around the stone structure. Sarah was holding what looked like a child's toy, maybe a small stuffed animal or doll. She was turning it over in her hands, running her fingers across it with the kind of gentle attention you give to something precious and fragile. I was trying to get a better look when one of the other people in the circle looked up and stared directly at me. Not in my general direction, directly at me, like he could see through the trees and the shadows and the 20 yards of distance between us. He was maybe 40, with graying hair and the kind of lined face that comes from spending a lot of time outdoors. But his eyes were wrong. Not the color or the shape, they looked normal enough from a distance. It was the way they moved, too fluid and too knowing, like there was something else looking out through them. He stood up slowly and said something to the others. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. Alert. Warning. Time to go. The whole group began to disperse, moving away from the fire in different directions. Sarah was the last to leave, carefully tucking whatever she'd been holding into her jacket pocket before following the others into the trees. I waited until they were all gone, then crept closer to the fire. It was still burning, but the flames had changed from blue to a more normal orange-yellow. The heat was wrong though. Instead of warmth, it gave off a kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones. Around the fire pit, the ground was marked with symbols that looked like they'd been scratched into the dirt with sticks or fingers. Not letters or numbers, but shapes that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. Circles and spirals and angular patterns that made your eyes water if you stared too long. I took photos of everything, but when I checked the images on my camera's display, they showed only normal dirt and scattered leaves. Whatever I was seeing, it wasn't showing up on film. I was getting ready to leave when I heard voices approaching through the trees. Not the same people from the fire. These voices were different, younger. Kids, maybe, or teenagers. I ducked behind a fallen log and waited. 3 kids emerged from the path I'd taken to get there. They looked like they were in high school, maybe 16 or 17. 2 boys and a girl, all of them moving with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you're going and what you're supposed to do when you get there. "Fire's still going," one of the boys said. "That's good." "Course it's still going," the girl replied. "It's October 4th. Got 3 more days." They walked over to the fire pit and began pulling items out of their back pockets. More personal objects, a class ring, a bracelet, what looked like a folded letter. They tossed them into the flames one by one, and each time something hit the fire, the flames would jump higher and shift back toward that cold blue color. "You think it's really gonna work this time?" the second boy asked. He sounded nervous, younger than the others. "Course it'll work," the girl said. "Worked for 80 years, didn't it? Worked for our parents, worked for their parents." "Yeah, but what if the insurance guy messes things up? What if he doesn't leave in time?" The first boy laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Insurance guy's not gonna mess anything up. He's part of it now, whether he knows it or not." "What do you mean?" "I mean he's been walking around town for 3 days, asking questions, digging into things. You think they don't know about him? You think they haven't been watching?" The girl nodded. "Exactly. He showed up right on schedule, just like they always do. 20 years ago it was the health inspector. 40 years ago it was the census taker. Always somebody from outside, always somebody who doesn't know the rules." I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weird fire. "But what happens to him?" the nervous boy asked. The other 2 exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "Same thing that happens to all of them," the girl said quietly. "He becomes part of the pattern. Part of what keeps the rest of us safe." They finished throwing their items into the fire and headed back down the path toward town. I waited until their voices faded completely, then got out of there as fast as I could without making noise. Back at the inn, I sat in my room trying to process what I'd overheard. Insurance guy's part of it now. Same thing that happens to all of them. Always somebody from outside, always somebody who doesn't know the rules. I pulled out the files I'd copied from the courthouse and started looking through them with fresh eyes. Sure enough, every 20 years there was an outsider who'd come to Millbrook on official business right around the time of the incidents. 1943, a federal agricultural inspector. 1963, a census worker. 1983, a health department investigator. 2003, a state environmental assessor. All of them had filed routine reports and left town within a few days. At least that's what the official records showed. But now I was starting to wonder if any of them had actually left at all. I was still going through the files when someone knocked on my door. It was Martha, holding a dinner tray covered with a white cloth. "Thought you might be hungry," she said. "Kitchen's closed early tonight, but I saved you some pot roast." I hadn't ordered room service, but I stepped aside to let her in. She set the tray down on the small table by the window and pulled back the cloth. The food looked normal enough: meat, potatoes, vegetables, a dinner roll. But something about it made my stomach turn. "That's very kind of you," I said, "but I'm not really hungry right now." Martha looked at me with those calm, knowing eyes. "You should eat something, Mr. Coleman. Going to be a long few days and you'll need your strength." "What happens in a few days?" October 7th. The culmination. End of the cycle, beginning of the next one. She smoothed down the cloth and folded it neatly. "After that, things go back to normal for another 20 years. "And what exactly happens on October 7th? Martha was quiet for a moment, studying my face like she was trying to decide how much to tell me. "The faceless ones come out," she said finally. "They've been waiting underground for 20 years, sleeping and dreaming and getting hungry. When they wake up, they need sustenance. Memories, experiences, the essence of a life fully lived." I felt the blood drain from my face. Whose life? Someone from outside. Someone who doesn't belong to the community, doesn't have roots here. Someone whose disappearance won't disrupt the natural order of things. She said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment for the full implication to sink in. You're talking about murder. Martha shook her head. Not murder. Sacrifice. There's a difference. Murder is wasteful, destructive. Sacrifice serves a purpose, maintains a balance. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkening street. The faceless ones aren't evil, Mr. Coleman. They're old. Older than this town, older than the mountains themselves. They were here first, and we've learned to coexist with them. By feeding them people every 20 years. By maintaining the agreement our ancestors made. They sleep for 20 years, we provide what they need when they wake, and in return they leave the rest of us alone. It's worked for 8 decades. I backed away from her, my heart hammering. You're all insane. We're survivors. Martha turned from the window and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. This town has never had a murder, Mr. Coleman. Never had a robbery or an assault or any of the violence that plagues other places. Our children grow up safe, our elderly die peacefully in their sleep, our families stay together for generations. That's worth something. Not worth killing innocent people. One innocent person. Every 20 years. Set against the safety and prosperity of 600 people for 2 decades. She shrugged. The mathematics are simple enough. I was reaching for my phone, though I wasn't sure who I planned to call or what I planned to say. Martha noticed the gesture. Cell service has been spotty all day, she said. Storm coming in from the west, probably won't clear up until after the weekend. I checked my phone. No signal. The landline's out too, she continued. Old wiring, you know how it is. These things happen. She moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at me. Eat something, Mr. Coleman. You'll feel better. And get some rest, tomorrow's going to be a busy day. After she left, I tried the door and found it locked from the outside. The window was painted shut, and even if I could get it open, it was a 20-foot drop to the gravel parking lot below. I was trapped. I spent the next hour looking for another way out of the room, but the inn had been built solidly and Martha had thought of everything. The door was heavy wood with an old-fashioned lock that I couldn't pick. The window wouldn't budge despite my best efforts. Even the bathroom vent was too small to crawl through. Eventually, I sat down at the table and stared at the dinner tray Martha had brought. The food looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eating it would be a mistake. The last step in some process I didn't understand. As the hours passed, the food began to change. Not spoiling, the opposite. It seemed to become more appetizing, more perfect. The meat looked more tender, the vegetables more vibrant. The smell that rose from the plate was incredible, rich and complex, and exactly what my empty stomach wanted. I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and that had been almost 12 hours ago. My body was telling me to eat, that whatever was happening in Millbrook, I'd need energy to deal with it. But some deeper instinct was telling me not to touch the food. That once I started eating, I wouldn't be able to stop. And that eating would change something fundamental about my situation. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. The low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, making the windows rattle and my teeth ache. But this time it was louder, more insistent. I went to the window and looked out at Main Street. The shadows were moving again, but now I could see them clearly. They flowed along the sidewalks and pooled in doorways, and within the shadows were shapes that weren't quite human. The faceless ones. They were taller than I'd remembered from the night before, maybe 8 feet from head to foot. Their bodies were wrong in every way that mattered, too thin, too fluid, covered in something that might have been skin but moved like water. And where their faces should have been, there was only smooth blankness, like someone had forgotten to finish sculpting them. But the most disturbing thing about them wasn't how they looked. It was how they moved. With purpose. With intelligence. Like they were following a plan that had been worked out in advance and practiced for decades. There were dozens of them now, moving through the streets in groups of 3 or 4. They stopped at certain buildings, standing motionless for long minutes before moving on. At each stop, one of them would press its blank face against a window or door, like it was listening for something inside. I watched them patrol for over an hour, trying to figure out the pattern. Some buildings they ignored completely. Others got brief visits. But there were 3 or 4 places where they lingered, where multiple groups would converge and seem to have some kind of silent consultation. One of those places was the Millbrook Inn. As I watched, a group of 4 faceless ones approached the building directly below my window. They moved with that same fluid wrongness, like they were swimming through air instead of walking through it. The leader, if that's what it was, stopped directly beneath my window and looked up. Even through the glass, even from 20 feet away, I could feel its attention like a physical weight. It had no eyes that I could see, but it was definitely looking at me. It raised one arm, too long, too jointed, ending in something that might have been fingers but moved independently like they were tentacles, and pointed directly at my window. The others gathered around it, all of them turning their blank faces upward, all of them pointing at my room. Then, impossibly, I heard one of them speak. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing my ears entirely and resonating inside my skull. It was like hearing someone talk underwater, distorted and strange but unmistakably intelligent. Soon, it said. 3 more days. Then feeding time. The group dispersed, moving away from the inn toward other parts of town. But the message was clear enough. They knew I was here. They knew I was trapped. And they were counting down the hours until October 7th. I stepped back from the window and tried to think of a way out of this situation. Running wasn't an option. The town was surrounded by dense forest, and even if I could somehow get out of the locked room, the faceless ones would probably find me before I made it to the main road. Fighting wasn't an option either. How do you fight something that doesn't seem to be entirely physical, something that can move through shadows and speak directly into your mind? That left negotiation, but what did I have to offer? What could possibly convince an entire town to abandon an arrangement that had kept them safe for 80 years? I was still trying to come up with a plan when exhaustion finally caught up with me. I'd been running on adrenaline for hours, and my body was demanding rest whether I wanted to give it or not. I lay down on the bed fully clothed, keeping one eye on the window and one ear tuned for any sounds from the hallway. The rumbling had stopped and the streets were quiet again, but I didn't trust the silence. Just before I fell asleep, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps in the hallway outside my room, soft and careful. Someone, or something, moving back and forth like they were pacing, or keeping watch. I woke to gray morning light and the sound of someone unlocking my door. Martha came in carrying another breakfast tray, moving with the same calm efficiency she'd shown the night before. "Sleep well?" she asked, setting the tray down on the table. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body stiff from sleeping in my clothes. About as well as you'd expect for someone who's been told he's going to be fed to monsters. Martha smiled, but there was something sad in it. "The faceless ones aren't monsters, Mr. Coleman. They're just different, older. They have needs that don't align with human morality, but that doesn't make them evil." She uncovered the breakfast tray. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. It looked perfect, just like the dinner from the night before, and I could already feel my empty stomach responding to the smell. "You didn't eat last night," Martha observed. "That wasn't wise. Your body needs fuel for what's coming." "And what exactly is coming?" "Today? Nothing much. Tomorrow's the 6th, that's when the preparations begin in earnest. Then October 7th. She trailed off, studying my face. "It's not as bad as you're imagining, Mr. Coleman. The process is actually quite peaceful. Like falling asleep and dreaming the most vivid dream of your life, except the dream becomes part of something larger and more important than any individual existence." I stared at her. "You're talking about my death like it's a spiritual experience, isn't it?" Martha moved to the window and looked out at the street. "Every 20 years, someone like you comes to Millbrook. Someone with no connections, no family waiting for them, no life that can't be easily explained away. And every 20 years, that person becomes part of something that's kept this community safe and prosperous for 8 decades. What makes you think I don't have family? People who'll come looking for me?" Martha turned from the window with that same sad smile. "Because we know everything about you, Mr. Coleman. Jack Coleman, age 34, employed by Mutual Security Insurance for 8 years. Parents deceased, no siblings, no significant relationships that have lasted longer than 6 months. You live alone in a studio apartment in Cleveland, you have $1,700 in your checking account, and your most significant social interaction is with a bartender named Mike who works at the place you go for dinner twice a week." I felt the blood drain from my face. She was right about all of it. "We've been watching you for 3 years, Martha continued. "Ever since our records showed that 2023 was going to be a cycle year. The insurance claim was real. Sarah really did lose her house in a fire. But the claim was also a directed. Made sure it would land on your desk, made sure you'd be the one to come investigate. You've been planning this for 3 years? We've been planning this for 80 years, Mr. Coleman. Every detail, every contingency. This community has survived by being very, very careful about how we manage our relationship with the faceless ones." She moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at me one more time. "Eat your breakfast. Trust me, you'll want to keep your strength up for what's coming." After she left, I heard the lock click again. But this time, I also heard something else, voices in the hallway, multiple people having a conversation in tones too low for me to make out the words. The preparations Martha had mentioned were beginning, and I was running out of time. October 6th passed in a blur of sounds from outside my locked room. Footsteps in the hallways, muffled conversations, the occasional scraping of heavy objects being moved around downstairs. The whole inn felt like it was preparing for something, a festival maybe, or a funeral. Martha brought me meals at regular intervals, always perfectly prepared, always smelling incredible. But I didn't touch any of it. Some instinct told me that eating their food would make whatever was coming easier for them and worse for me. By evening, I was lightheaded from hunger, but my mind felt clearer than it had in days. "Tomorrow's the day," Martha said when she brought the dinner tray. October 7th. Been 20 years since the last time, and the whole town's excited. Well, excited isn't quite the right word. More like relieved. Like we're finally going to be able to exhale after holding our breath for 2 decades. I was sitting on the bed, back against the headboard, trying to conserve energy. What exactly happens tomorrow? The ceremony starts at sunset. The whole community gathers at the old stone circle, the one you found a few days ago. The faceless ones rise from the deep places where they sleep, and we make the offering. She paused, studying my face. Your contribution to the continuing prosperity of Millbrook. And after that? After that they feed. And then they sleep for another 20 years and life goes back to normal. Normal for everyone except me. Martha sat down in the chair by the window, something she'd never done during her previous visits. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked tired. "Mr. Coleman, I know this seems monstrous to you. Believe me, I understand. When I was young, maybe 12 years old, I watched them take the census worker in 1963. I had nightmares for months afterward. Then how can you do this? Because I've also seen what happens to communities that don't honor their agreements with the old powers." She was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the darkening street. "My grandmother grew up in a town called Blackwater, about 50 miles north of here. Similar situation, similar arrangement with something that lived in the mountains above the town. But sometime in the 1890s, the town council decided they were too modern, too civilized to keep making sacrifices to appease old superstitions." I waited for her to continue. "Blackwater lasted 6 months after they broke their agreement. Families started disappearing in the middle of the night. Children would go to bed and never wake up, adults would leave for work and never come home. By spring the town was empty. Nothing but vacant houses and empty streets. Maybe people just left. Maybe they moved away because of the disappearances." Martha shook her head. "I've been to Blackwater, Mr. Coleman. What's left of it? The houses are still there, still furnished, still set up like people were planning to come back. Breakfast dishes on the tables, clothes hanging on the lines, children's toys scattered in the yards. But no people. Never any people." She stood up and walked to the door, then turned back to face me. "Tomorrow at sunset you have a choice. You can fight this, make it difficult for everyone, drag out the process and make it ugly. Or you can accept what's happening and let it be peaceful. Either way the result is the same. But one way is easier on you and easier on the community that has to live with what we do." After she left, I spent the night planning. Fighting wasn't really an option. I was locked in a room on the 2nd floor of a building surrounded by people who'd been planning this for years. Running wasn't an option either, even if I could somehow get out. But there might be another choice. I'd noticed something during my conversations with the townspeople. They all talked about the faceless ones with a mixture of fear and reverence, but also with a kind of resignation. Like they were dealing with a natural disaster or a terminal illness. Something unpleasant but inevitable. But what if it wasn't inevitable? What if their 80-year-old agreement could be renegotiated? It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. The next morning, October 7th, Martha came to my room earlier than usual. She was carrying clothes instead of a breakfast tray. "Time to get ready," she said, laying out what looked like a simple white robe on the bed. "The ceremony starts in a few hours, and there are preparations to be made." I looked at the robe. It was made of rough cotton, the kind of thing you might see in a monastery or a hospital. Clean and functional, but somehow ominous. What kind of preparations? Nothing too involved. A ritual cleansing, some basic ceremonies to prepare your essence for the transfer. It's all very dignified. And if I refuse? Martha's expression didn't change, but I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. "Then we do it the hard way," she said simply. "But I'd prefer not to. You seem like a decent man, Mr. Coleman, and you don't deserve to spend your last hours in pain and terror." The lock clicked and the door opened. 3 men entered, all of them locals I'd seen around town. They weren't carrying weapons, but they were all big enough that they didn't need to. "Your choice," Martha said. I looked at the three men, then at Martha, then at the white robe on the bed. Fighting would accomplish nothing except getting me hurt before the inevitable happened. And if I was going to try my desperate plan, I'd need to be conscious and coherent when the time came. "Fine," I said. "But I want to understand what's going to happen. All of it." Martha nodded. "That's fair. Understanding makes the process easier for everyone involved." The ritual cleansing turned out to be exactly what it sounded like. A shower with soap that smelled like herbs and flowers, followed by the white robe that fit surprisingly well. The men waited outside the bathroom door, polite but watchful. After I was dressed, they escorted me downstairs to the inn's lobby. The place looked different. All the furniture had been moved aside, and symbols had been drawn on the floor in what looked like chalk or white paint. The same shifting, angular patterns I'd seen around the fire pit in the woods. Sarah Hendricks was waiting for me, along with a dozen other townspeople I recognized. They were all dressed in similar white robes, and their expressions were solemn but not unfriendly, like mourners at a funeral for someone they'd barely known. "Mr. Coleman," Sarah said, stepping forward, "I want you to know that none of us take this lightly. What happens today, it's not done out of cruelty or malice. It's done out of necessity. I understand that's what you believe. It's what we know." She gestured toward the front door, where I could see more people gathering outside. "This community has thrived for 80 years because we honor our commitments. Our children grow up safe, our families prosper, our elderly die peacefully in their beds surrounded by people who love them. That's worth preserving. Even if it costs someone else's life every 20 years? Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said finally. "Even then." The procession to the stone circle took about an hour. The entire population of Millbrook seemed to be involved: men, women, children, elderly folks who had to be helped along the rough forest paths. Everyone dressed in white robes, everyone moving with the same quiet purpose. I walked in the center of the group, surrounded but not restrained. Where was I going to run? Even if I could somehow get away from 600 people, the forest stretched for miles in every direction, and I had no idea which way led to civilization. The stone circle looked different in daylight. Bigger, more elaborate, with details I hadn't noticed during my first visit. The stones themselves were carved with more of those shifting symbols, and the personal objects arranged around the base had been reorganized into precise patterns that hurt to look at directly. But the most disturbing change was the pit. In the center of the circle, where there had been solid ground before, a hole had been opened. Maybe 10 feet across and deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom. The edges were perfectly smooth, like they'd been cut with precision tools, and a cold wind rose from the depths carrying that same organic wrong smell I'd noticed before. The townspeople arranged themselves in concentric circles around the pit, with me standing at the very edge. Sarah took a position directly across from me, and Martha stood to my right. Everyone else filled in the spaces between. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped noticeably. Not the gradual cooling you'd expect from nightfall, but a sudden, sharp cold that made everyone's breath visible in puffs of vapor. And then I heard it. The rumbling sound from deep underground, but louder than I'd ever heard it before. The stones around us began to vibrate, and the symbols carved into their surfaces started to glow with a faint blue light. "It's time," Sarah said, raising her voice to be heard over the growing rumble. "The faceless ones are waking." Something began to emerge from the pit. At first it was just movement in the darkness below, shapeless forms shifting and writhing. But gradually figures began to climb up toward the surface. The faceless ones, but not like I'd seen them before. These were larger, more substantial, with bodies that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight. The first one to emerge was maybe 12 feet tall, its form constantly shifting between solid and ethereal. Where its face should have been, there was not just blankness but an actual void, a space that seemed to pull light and warmth out of the surrounding air. More followed. Dozens of them, climbing up from whatever deep place they'd been sleeping for 20 years. They arranged themselves around the inner edge of the circle, towering over the gathered townspeople but not threatening them. This was clearly a familiar ritual, practiced and perfected over decades. When the last of them had emerged, the rumbling stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no insects, no sound of breathing from 600 people. Even the usual background noise of a living forest had been swallowed up. The largest of the faceless ones, the one who had emerged first, turned its void face toward me. When it spoke, its voice bypassed my ears entirely and resonated inside my skull. "The offering," it said. "As agreed. As always." This was my moment. My one chance to try something different. Wait, I said, stepping forward. My voice sounded tiny in the vast silence, but it carried. I want to propose a different arrangement. The reaction from the townspeople was immediate. Gasps, murmurs of shock and fear. Sarah stepped toward me with alarm written across her face. "Mr. Coleman, please don't. Let him speak," the faceless one said, its voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. The crowd fell silent again. I took a deep breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered by fear and adrenaline. "You feed every 20 years, I said, addressing the faceless one directly. "One person's life, one person's essence. But what if there was a better way? What if instead of taking everything from one person, you could take a little from everyone?" The void face turned slightly as if considering this. "Explain." 600 people in this town, I continued, feeling like I was walking a tightrope over an abyss. If each person gave up just a small piece, a memory, and experienced something significant but not vital, you'd have more to feed on than you get from one complete life. And nobody would have to die. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Around the circle, I could see the townspeople exchanging glances, some hopeful, others skeptical. "Interesting," the faceless one said finally. "But the agreement is old, established, proven to work." "Agreements can be modified," I said, "if both parties agree to the change." "And what makes you think we would agree?" This was the critical moment. The make or break point where my desperate plan would either save my life or get me killed in a more dramatic fashion. "Because you're not getting stronger," I said, hoping I was right. 20 years ago you needed one person. 40 years ago you needed one person. 80 years ago you needed one person. But you're not growing, you're not thriving. You're just maintaining. What if there was a way to actually grow stronger instead of just surviving? The faceless one was silent for a long moment. Around the circle, I could feel the tension from 600 people holding their breath. "Show us," it said finally. I had been hoping for this. During the long hours locked in my room, I'd thought about what I could offer as a demonstration. Something significant enough to prove the concept, but not so much that it would leave me unable to function. I closed my eyes and focused on a memory from my childhood. My 8th birthday party, the last one my parents had thrown for me before the divorce, when our family was still intact and I still believed in happy endings. I could remember every detail. The chocolate cake with blue frosting, the stack of presents on the kitchen table, the way my mother had laughed when my father told a joke that wasn't really funny but was funny because he thought it was funny. I took that memory, all of it, from start to finish, every emotion and sensation, and I pushed it outward. Offered it up to the void face staring down at me. The faceless one reached out with something that wasn't quite an arm and touched something that wasn't quite my forehead. I felt the memory being drawn out of me like water through a straw. Not painful exactly, but definitely a loss. A piece of myself that was gone forever. But when it was over, I was still standing. Still thinking. Still me, just with one less happy memory to call on. The faceless one straightened up, and for the first time since I'd seen them, its form seemed more solid, more present. "Remarkable," it said, and there was something like surprise in its mental voice. "Richer than expected. More nutritious than the desperation and terror we usually consume." Hope flared in my chest. "So you'll consider the new arrangement?" The faceless one looked around the circle at the gathered townspeople, then back at me. "We will consider it. But the decision is not ours alone. The humans must also agree." All eyes turned to Sarah. As the descendant of the family that had originally made the agreement, she apparently had the authority to speak for the community. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the ground while she thought. Finally, she looked up at the faceless one. "What would this new arrangement require from us?" "Each adult contributes one significant memory every 20 years. Each child contributes when they reach the age of 18. In return, we sleep peacefully and do not hunt in your territory. And no one dies?" "No one dies." Sarah looked around the circle at her neighbors, her friends, her family. I could see the internal debate playing out on her face, the pull of tradition and proven safety against the appeal of a solution that didn't require murder. "All in favor?" she called out. Hands began to rise. Slowly at first, then more quickly as people saw their neighbors voting. Within a minute, nearly every hand in the circle was raised. Opposed? A handful of hands went up. Maybe 20 people out of 600, mostly older folks who I suspected had lived through multiple cycles and were reluctant to change something that had worked for so long. "The community agrees," Sarah said, turning back to the faceless one. "We accept the new arrangement." What followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. One by one, the townspeople stepped forward and offered up memories to the faceless ones. Not their most precious ones, nobody gave up their wedding day or the birth of their children. But significant moments nonetheless. First days of school, family vacations, the pride of a job well done, the satisfaction of a problem solved. Each offering made the faceless ones a little more solid, a little more present. By the time everyone had contributed, they looked almost human, still tall and strange, still wrong in fundamental ways, but no longer the ethereal shadow things that had first emerged from the pit. The largest one approached me as the ceremony was winding down. "You have given us something we did not know we lacked," it said. "Hope instead of despair. Joy instead of terror. These are better. Will you honor the new agreement?" "We will. For 20 years we sleep. When we wake, we will expect the same offering from your community. And if they provide it." The void face turned toward the gathered townspeople. "We will continue to leave them in peace." The faceless ones began to descend back into the pit, moving with what looked like satisfaction. They had gotten what they came for and maybe more than they'd expected. As the last of them disappeared underground, the pit began to close itself. Not like dirt falling in, but like the earth was healing from a wound. Within minutes, there was solid ground where the opening had been. The ceremony was over. The crisis was past. And somehow, miraculously, I was still alive. The walk back to town was different from the procession out to the stone circle. People were talking, laughing, celebrating. Children who had been quiet and solemn during the ceremony were running ahead of their parents, playing games and acting like normal kids. "That was well done," Sarah said, falling into step beside me. "I wasn't sure it would work, but you were right." They seemed happier with the new arrangement. "How do you feel about it?" I asked. "Losing a memory instead of gaining a new neighbor every 20 years? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "The memory I gave up was my first heartbreak. 16 years old, thought the world was ending because Jimmy Morrison didn't ask me to the school dance." She smiled. "I can live without that particular piece of my past. And it beats having to explain to my children why sometimes nice people have to die for the greater good." Back at the inn, Martha prepared my room like nothing had happened. Fresh sheets, towels, a dinner tray with food that looked normal and smelled normal and wasn't designed to make me compliant. "When will you be leaving?" she asked as she straightened up the small desk by the window. "Tomorrow morning, probably. I've got a report to file, though I'm not sure what I'm going to put in it." Martha smiled. "House fire, electrical cause, total loss. Standard payout, no complications. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the best one." I nodded. "And the new arrangement? How will that work going forward?" "We'll figure it out as we go. 20 years is a long time, plenty of opportunity to work out the details." She paused at the door. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman. What you did tonight, it changes everything for this community. Our children will grow up in a different world because of your idea." After she left, I sat at the window looking out at Main Street. It looked like any other small town settling in for the night. Porch lights coming on, curtains being drawn, the comfortable routine of a community winding down after a long day. But I knew the truth now. I knew what lived under the mountains, what slept in the deep places and woke every 20 years hungry for human experience. And I knew that the people of Millbrook had found a way to coexist with something that most communities would have run from or tried to fight. They'd made a deal with monsters and somehow managed to keep their humanity in the process. And now maybe they'd found a way to make that deal a little more humane. I finished my report the next morning over breakfast. House fire, electrical cause, total loss, claim approved. Simple, straightforward, exactly what the insurance company expected to see. I packed my bags and loaded them into my car, then took one last walk through downtown Millbrook. In the daylight, it looked like the kind of place you might want to retire to. Quiet, peaceful, the sort of community where people looked out for each other and traditions mattered. Which was all true, I suppose. Just not in the way an outsider would expect. As I was getting ready to leave, Sarah Hendricks approached my car. She was carrying a small wrapped package. "Something to remember us by," she said, handing it through the window. I unwrapped it as I drove away from Millbrook. Inside was a photograph of the town from maybe 50 years ago, back when Main Street was busier and the buildings were newer. A normal-looking place full of normal-looking people, living normal lives in a community that had learned to manage something very abnormal. On the back, someone had written, "Thank you for showing us a better way. The people of Millbrook, October 2023. I keep that photograph on my desk now, back in my office in Cleveland. Most of the time, I can go days without thinking about what happened in that mountain town. But every now and then, usually late at night when I'm working alone, I remember the faceless ones and the choice I made and the community that trusted a stranger to help them find a better path forward. And I wonder what other agreements are out there, in other small towns tucked away in forgotten corners of the country. What other communities have learned to coexist with things that shouldn't exist, making compromises that most people would find unthinkable. The world is bigger and stranger than most people realize. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, you get to see behind the curtain and discover just how much strangeness we live alongside every day. Every 20 years, the faceless ones come out. But now, thanks to a desperate insurance investigator and a community willing to try something new, they come out to shared memories instead of stolen lives. It's not perfect. It's probably not even good by most moral standards. But it's better than what came before. And sometimes, better is the best you can hope for.